In this video, Dr. Jordan Peterson explains how we simplified the world.
And so actually you don't build a model of the whole world. And you build a model of only the parts of the world that are relevant to your ongoing microaction. Now, the problem that brings up is, how do you know what's relevant? And well, that's a tough question. And I would say the reason that you know what's relevant is because some things don't change over time, and you've been evolving through 3.5 billion years. So you've built yourself, if we go back to that other diagram, you imagine the levels there, from the micro activities to the abstractions. You think about how much building had to go in before you could undertake those micro actions. So like here, you could move your hand. Well, that's great. How do you get the hand? Well, you know, it took a long time. It took almost all of the 3.5 billion years before you managed to come up with a hand. So even underneath the micro actions, there's this massive evolutionary history that's been built up partly as a consequence of some of the unchanging features of the environment, or at least in consequence of some of the slower changing features of the environment, that has given you this incredibly complex body that's really good at doing some things and not very good at doing other things at all. And so that's how you solve the relevance problem. And I actually think it's one of the most powerful arguments for the necessity of evolutionary theory. It's like, this problem is so complex because it's not only do you have to adapt to the environment across time, so you have to build a body that adapts to the environment. It's worse than that. It's like the train passing through the box. The environment's not stable. It keeps shifting and turning and moving and twisting. And so not only do you have to adapt to the environment, you have to adapt flexibly to the environment while it transforms itself at different levels of what would you say? At different levels of totality. Because sometimes there's minor changes in the environment. Sometimes, you know, a meteor hits the Earth and, you know, we're plunged into darkness for 4 years, or there's an ice age or something like that. So the levels of transformation in the environment can be radical. And the evolutionary process has to keep up with that. And the way it works, apparently, like I don't believe this is the whole story, although it's more or less the whole Darwinian story, is that something more or less works and then makes 1 million copies of itself. And there's tiny variations in those copies, often, at least in principle, because of copying error, which is where I think the theory's weak. And then they all die except like 2. And so why didn't those die? And the answer is, well, they happened by chance to vary in the direction that the environment varied, and so they get to continue. And so the reason evolution works is because everything dies. Everything fails. So, because you think, well, keeping up with a randomly changing environment is impossible. Well, so how do you do it? Well, you do 1 million things. Most of them don't work, but you only have to succeed enough to propagate yourself once. So now, I think that that's not exactly right, because I don't believe that our understanding of evolution is complete. There's a bunch of reasons I don't believe it. One is, DNA is pretty damn complex. It's not obvious how it could have evolved. And even the people who discovered DNA were very, very perplexed by the fact that it existed. So one of them, and I told you this, thought that it came from outer space and it evolved somewhere else. You know, and you might think about that as a crazy theory, but cosmic winds, like solar winds and that sort of thing, can propel tiny things vast distances relatively rapidly, and over 13.5 billion years, you can really get around. I think the estimates, even if you used transportation methods that are about the speed that we have, you could colonize the whole galaxy in some like 20 million years, something like that, because it's exponential. So 20 million years is a tiny, tiny subset of 3.5 billion years. So it's not as far-fetched as it sounds. The problem is it doesn't address the problem, which is, yeah, okay, it came from somewhere else, but how did it get there? Right, it just pushes the problem back. But there's this other issue too, which is called epigenesis. And that's really put an old spoke in the scientific wheels in the last 20 years, because the theory was 20 years ago that all evolution proceeded through random mutation, and it was random, right? But it turns out that's not exactly right, because there have been a number of demonstrations that if something happens to generation A, that will produce a transformation in the genetic information that's transferred to generation B. And the transformation often seems not merely a consequence of damage, but actually a form of adaptation to the new environment. So Now that's a tough one, like, you know, because 20 years ago, when I was studying evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology, if someone would have said, well, you can transmit acquired characteristics, it would have been like, you're over there with the creationists, because that was no go, that was against the rules. But it does happen, and the fact that epigenesis happens at all means that there's a lot of things about how DNA works that we don't know. And I actually think what's happening is that if I take one of you and I put you in a radically new environment, new genes will turn on in your brain and code for new proteins. And so it's like you're sitting there, but in some sense there's a whole set of potential yous that are sitting there. And a lot of that potential is actually locked in the genetic code. I mean, it's dependent on the information that's in the environment around it, because it's not all in the code, but it's enough to get the process started. So if I take you out of situation A and put you in situation B, you build new brain structures at the micro level. So you're actually a different person. And, you know, that's a very interesting way of thinking about the consequences of something like exposure in psychotherapy. It's like, okay, you're all timid and there's 18 things you're terrified of. And so you go out and you master one of them. It's like, poof, your brain is not the same. So maybe now you're a little braver, and then, you know, you go master another one, and a bunch more of you turns on. Now, I don't know if when one thing turns on, something else turns off. You know, if it's, you know, what I mean is that there's only so much of you that can be turned on at any one time. But maybe a lot more of you could be turned on than is turned on. So, and I think, you know, it looks like that, because people who really challenge themselves across the span of their life, they develop talents in multiple directions. You know, people can really be amazingly good at a ridiculous number of things. So